I'm Charlotte Evans. When I was 27 during my mother's 60th birthday party, I was asked to record a video of her receiving the keys to her new car. As if Brandon, my older brother, had been the one who bought it. But it was me. I was the one who had worked 3 jobs for 6 months to afford that gift. Mom beamed, thanked Brandon in front of the entire family. Me. Right after filming, she handed me a pile of dishes and said, "Take these in and wash them, sweetheart. You're good at that sort of thing." No one knew how hard I'd worked. And while washing those dishes, I saw a $10,000 check from an investor, made out to Brandon. The business idea it was funding? The very idea they once called a silly little fantasy. Have you ever had your own family steal your hard work, then smile while you stood there holding the pieces of your pride? If you've ever been dismissed, share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear how I fought not for revenge but to reclaim myself. Because some dishes need to be cooked in fire to be truly done. I remember being 17, standing in front of a packed high school auditorium, receiving the state-level culinary award. I thought maybe this time they'll be proud of me. I brought home a shiny little trophy and a scholarship offer from the Northeast Culinary Institute. I placed the trophy on the living room shelf next to the family photos. Mom glanced at it and said, "You should probably keep that in your room. We don't want guests thinking we're showing off kitchen stuff." Dad gave a quick nod and asked if Brandon had eaten dinner. Brandon had just failed his 3rd college class in a row, but he was still the future of this family. No matter what I did, big or small, it seemed to make them feel embarrassed, never proud. When Brandon got accepted into a local private college, Mom threw a huge party, invited all her colleagues and friends. I was tasked with cooking everything, even while preparing for the final round of the state culinary competition. That night, my hands were blistered from scrubbing dishes. While the crowd raised their glasses to toast him, I stood behind the kitchen door and heard my mother say, full of pride, "Brandon's the first in the family to go to college. My son is going places." No one mentioned me. No one asked if I needed help. When I went back to my room, hands still smelling of dish soap, Brandon was laughing with friends, showing off the new laptop our parents bought him for school. Me. I was still writing out my bakery business plan by hand on scrap paper, because my old laptop broke junior year and no one offered to replace it. I once believed I could chase my dream in my own way. When I won a full scholarship to the Culinary Institute in Vermont, I almost couldn't believe it. I had spent months planning, applying, practicing dishes through sleepless nights. It was one of the most prestigious scholarships, only 3 awarded nationwide each year. I printed the offer letter, brought it home, and placed it in front of my mother, heart pounding with hope. She read it, held the paper for a while, then frowned slightly. "Well, that's nice," she said, setting it on the table. "But right now you should think of the family. Brandon needs startup capital. Instead of going far away to learn cooking, you could take online classes and use the money to help him out." I froze. "But Mom, this scholarship isn't money I can withdraw. It's a full-ride, in-person program. Only 3 people were chosen." "Then decline it," she cut in. "We can't always let Brandon struggle on his own. He has big ideas. This family needs to support him." I tried to explain, cried, pleaded. But she just shook her head, cold and unmoved, like I was being irrational. That evening, Brandon walked into my room, sat at the edge of my bed and said casually, "You can cook anytime. Nobody's stopping you. But startup opportunities? They don't come around twice." I turned away so he wouldn't see my tear-streaked face. That summer, I worked at a small-town bakery. Every morning, I was up by 4 to prep orders. Afternoons, I tutored to make extra money. One day, I was delivering cakes for a wedding during a storm. I lost control of my bike at a bend near the lake, tore my knee open, the cake was ruined. I lay unconscious on the roadside for nearly 20 minutes until a pedestrian called for help. I woke up in the hospital with 7 stitches in my knee and a sprained right wrist. I couldn't even hold a knife for 2 weeks. I called my mother, hoping someone would come, if not to help, at least to ask how I was. "I'm busy, honey," she said quickly. "It's Brandon's birthday week. We're having dinner at that Mexican place he likes. Just get some rest and come home later, okay?" I hung up in silence. The cold I felt didn't come from the wound but from deep in my chest. They didn't come. No one did. During my hospital stay, the only visitor I had was an elderly Italian nurse who later taught me how to make biscotti with one hand. I returned home early one morning, my left arm still in a bandage. My bag sat untouched on the porch. No one had unlocked the door. Inside, I heard laughter and camera clicks. Brandon was unwrapping gifts. Mom's voice echoed, "Oh wow, this camera is top tier, sweetheart." I unlocked the back door myself and stepped into the kitchen. No one asked where I had been. No one asked if I was okay. I stood there in the room I once considered the safest place in the house, feeling like a shadow that slipped past their lives unnoticed. Just a name on a utility bill. An unpaid housemaid. A daughter who knew her place, in the way that served their needs. And from that moment on, I knew I had to rise on my own. No one was going to reach down and pull me up unless I stepped out of Brandon's shadow first. But I couldn't leave yet. Not then. I didn't know the deepest betrayal was still waiting for me, and it would come from the one person I still trusted in the family. I started writing my food truck business plan last winter, while snow blanketed the roof and the kitchen of the pizza shop where I worked glowed warm deep into the night. That dream was born during evenings spent alone in my tiny apartment above the restaurant, eating cold bread and imagining a yellow truck full of warmth, where I'd cook flavors rooted in memory, not to impress anyone but to finally be myself. I tested more than 20 recipes, adjusted every pinch of salt, every degree of heat in the sauces. I surveyed locations, calculated operating costs, even hired an art student to design my brand identity, with a logo featuring an old wooden spoon, the only thing my mother left me untouched. After 6 months, I had a completed plan, detailed budget, seasonal menu, and a full list of local street food fairs. I didn't have much capital, but I had something I believed would take me farther. Faith in my palate and my own 2 hands. I didn't plan to tell Mom. But at a rare family dinner I couldn't skip, Aunt Patricia's birthday, I slipped. Brandon was bragging about some new business concepts, but said he hadn't found the right niche yet. As I was plating the vegetable stew I had made, Mom suddenly turned to me and asked, "Are you still into that cooking thing? Or have you moved on?" I gave her a soft smile, not offended. I was used to this tone. I answered, "Just working on something small, Mom, a food truck." Then I let it slip. I talked a little about the menu, the garlic butter seafood pasta in New Orleans style, the grilled pork sandwich with brown sauce like we used to have at home, and a caramelized onion soup I had once served at a spring wedding. Mom said nothing. Brandon stayed quiet. I thought maybe they just didn't care. But 1 week later I got a call from Nancy, a former coworker from the Italian restaurant. She said she was attending a pitch event where Brandon had just presented a food truck project called Memory on Wheels. The name? Almost identical to my original sketch, A Taste of Memory. Nancy said, "Charlotte, he described dishes exactly like the ones you used to make for us during night shifts, even the onion soup with charred cilantro. And he said they were family recipes passed down from your mom." I couldn't speak. My hands trembled as I opened the slide deck Nancy emailed me. Every image, every dish, every price list, every layout, was mine. Every word on those slides felt like a cut across the palm of the hand I'd spent 6 months cooking with in silence. That same day I went straight to my parents' house. No warning. I walked in as they were watching Brandon's pitch video on the living room TV. Mom looked up, surprised. "You came without calling?" I stood in the middle of the room, my voice dry. "Why would you do that, Mom? I told you about my food truck project. Why did Brandon take all of my ideas and pitch them for funding?" Brandon leaned back in the chair, smirking. "It was an opportunity. If you didn't do it, someone else would. Besides, anyone can come up with an idea." I turned to my mother. "And you? You listened to me, heard every dish I described, and then handed it all to him?" He shrugged. "Sweetheart, don't make this a family issue. Brandon has what it takes to bring it to life. You're good in the kitchen, but business isn't easy. And if you really wanted it, you'd come up with something else. Your brother acted first, so he gets to move forward." I looked at each of them. My father said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. Brandon kept fast-forwarding his pitch video like nothing shameful had happened. My mother stared at me with that same look she always gave me, like I was a stubborn child who just didn't get it. "You need to learn to step back, Charlotte," she continued, her tone softening. "Families are meant to support each other. Everyone plays a part." I nodded. There was nothing left to say. I walked out without a goodbye. I didn't take anything with me but an old backpack and my recipe notebook, the one that had been copied nearly word for word. I went straight back to my tiny rental apartment above the pizza shop, where I worked part-time, earning just enough to cover utilities and buy fresh produce to test new recipes. The smell of melted cheese from downstairs floated up warm and familiar, but all I felt was a deep chill inside. I turned on the light, opened my laptop, and deleted every page of my old business plan. I stared at the blank screen, wondering how many times I would have to start over, just because my own family thought my dream was something they could divvy up. I knew I had just lost something big, but I also knew that if they'd stolen my dream once, they'd do it again. And if I let them, it wouldn't just be their fault, it would be mine. That yellow truck in my dream was no longer just a goal. It had become my reason to rise, so no one could ever step over me again. I returned to the prep station below the pizza shop on a quiet Monday evening. It was drizzling outside, and the kitchen lights reflected off the old tiled walls like the last warmth clinging to a worn-out day. I tied back my hair, washed my hands, and started prepping the Italian subs for the final orders before closing. I didn't notice I was being watched until a deep, gravelly voice, worn from years of smoke, spoke from behind the ingredient shelf. "You've got the hands of someone who's cooked in fire." Not in a classroom. I turned. A tall man with silver hair pulled into a short ponytail and a flour-dusted apron was leaning against the counter, watching me. His eyes were deep, dark brown, not sharp like a critic's, but steady like someone who's failed before and stood back up. His shirt read Miles, executive chef, the thread worn thin. I'm just trying to get the order right," I replied, a little flustered. Miles stepped closer, eyeing the filling I was carefully spreading onto a slice of ciabatta. "No," he said, shaking his head, pointing to the sauce I'd just added. "You threw in some crushed red pepper, didn't you? That's not in the house recipe." I froze. The customer was Italian. I thought a little heat might suit their taste. "Exactly," he said slowly, his tone low and steady. "But if you're going to do that, don't call it the house sandwich. Call it yours." I stood still. For a moment, the cramped kitchen space felt suddenly still. I didn't know why his words hit me so deeply, but they did. Miles walked over to the fridge, pulled out a jar of homemade stewed tomatoes and placed it on the counter in front of me. "Try using this instead of the canned stuff. I make it the way my mother did. Woman spent her life cooking without ever using a measuring spoon." I hesitated. "Aren't you worried the manager will say something?" He chuckled lightly, the way someone does when they've outlived all the rules and now choose which ones to break. "The manager won't know if the customer comes back for seconds." That night, after closing, when everyone else had gone home, I sat in the corner of the kitchen, holding the sandwich Miles had helped me make. The crust was crisp, the filling hot and tender, the sauce soaked deep into the meat like someone's childhood melting on my tongue. Miles poured me a glass of cold water and sat across from me. "Where did you learn to cook?" "Self-taught. I once earned a scholarship, but I never got to take it." He nodded, not asking why. "Good. People who teach themselves learn flavor before they learn technique. They cook from instinct." I looked up. "But instinct isn't enough in this industry." "True," he said, his voice deeper. "It's only enough to get you started. To keep going, you need discipline, fire, and a few failures." I looked down at my hands, calloused, faded burn marks across my knuckles. I used to think they proved I wasn't careful or good enough. But now they felt like the marks of someone learning to stand on her own. "Do you have a plan?" Miles asked. "I did," I replied slowly. "A food truck. I tested the menu, built the financial plan, even designed the logo. But then, let me guess, someone stole it?" he asked, like he'd heard 100 stories just like mine. I nodded. No need to explain. He didn't press further. Just reached for a blank sheet of paper, laid it flat on the table and said, "Start over. Write a new menu. From scratch." I stared at the page. But also a doorway into something no one had ever touched. I wasn't ready. But I knew if I didn't begin that night, I might never begin again. From then on, after every closing shift, I stayed behind with Miles. He taught me how to dice onions without crying, how to read oil temperature by sound, how to smell dough to know when it had been kneaded enough. Some nights we made something so off that we'd just throw it away without a word. He never praised me. But every time I tried something new, he'd just say, "Make it again." And I knew that was the highest praise I'd ever received. I began writing a new menu. No recycled recipes. I drew inspiration from the grilled pork my mom used to make on Saturdays, then changed the sauce. From the pasta I once ate in a hospital bed, then added fresh rosemary. Every dish was an old memory rewritten. I was rewriting my memories in the language of fire, salt, and steel. One evening when I finished plating a dish of fried chicken with honey chili glaze, Miles took a bite, paused, then nodded. For the first time, he said, "I'm jealous of a dish." I didn't respond. But I felt something inside me knit itself back together. Not through forgiveness but through the belief that I could create something no one could ever steal again. In that worn kitchen filled with the scent of melted cheese and the steady rhythm of knives on cutting boards, I found something I thought I'd lost long ago: the flame. Not just for cooking, but for living. One afternoon I was in the cold storage behind the kitchen, slicing a long loaf of bread to prep for the lunch rush, when the manager called me out front to sign for a delivery. It was a thick envelope, heavy cardstock, embossed with the Evans family crest in the corner, delivered via express courier. I wiped my hands, signed for it, then brought it back into the storage room and laid it next to a tray of washed tomatoes. I didn't open it right away. Something inside me hesitated. The envelope felt heavier than just paper, as if it was holding something I couldn't name. I took a deep breath, opened the flap, and pulled out a formal letter printed on ornate stationery. Invitation to the Evans Family Honor Celebration, celebrating 35 years of Scott Evans' career and announcing a new business partnership between Brandon Evans and Walter's company. I read every word, every line, not skipping a single detail, even the italicized sentence at the bottom. The program includes a family tribute and the introduction of a generational culinary achievement, a food project inspired by the Evans family kitchen. I gripped the paper tight as if squeezing hard enough could make the words disappear. But they didn't. They were printed bold and clear like a cold, final sentence. Tucked behind the invitation was a smaller envelope. I opened it. A legal letter, stamped with the seal of Simmons Tracy Law Office. I skimmed through the first paragraph until my eyes froze on the bolded line. Notice of intellectual property ownership. We hereby confirm that the copyright registration for the menu, A Taste of Memory, and its associated branding materials has been filed with the U.S. Copyright Office by Mr. Brandon Evans, Mrs. Eleanor Evans and Mr. Scott Evans as joint owners of the creative property under the Evans family name. I stood frozen in the storage room. My hand was still holding the bread knife, flour dust clinging to the wooden handle. A moment later my head started to spin, and my chest tightened like someone had just dumped a bucket of ice water straight into my lungs. I thought I'd grown numb to betrayal, but no. Some wounds never become familiar. They just wear you down until you don't have the strength to cry anymore. I dropped the knife onto the stainless steel table. The metallic clink echoed, dry and final. I slid down to the floor, leaning my back against a crate of lettuce, resting my head on a damp sleeve, eyes burning, but not a single tear would fall. I had lost more than just an idea. I had lost its name, the soul I had poured into it. And they, the ones who shared my last name, had signed their names to it as if I never existed. The storage room door creaked open. Miles walked in, still holding half a slice of unfinished pizza. "What happened?" he asked, his voice lower and slower than usual. I didn't answer right away. I just handed him the letter. He read it without blinking, then folded it and placed it on the shelf. "They stole your recipes," he said, unable to hide the anger. "Your name too." I nodded silently. "You wrote that menu. You spent 6 months crafting each dish. No one has the right to slap their name on someone else's work." "I trusted my mother," I said quietly. "I told her about it because I thought, maybe this time she'd see I was doing something that mattered." "Sometimes," Miles replied, "people don't recognize what matters until they've lost it. You know what they're planning next, don't you? They're holding an event, making it official. And I'll be the daughter standing outside the door." "Then don't stand outside anymore," he said, his eyes sharper than I'd ever seen. "They're stealing your story. You need to take it back, in your own way." I didn't respond. Inside I was a mess of emotions: anger, shame, sorrow, and a bone-deep exhaustion. But beneath it all, something flickered, the thought that if they were rewriting the story their way, then I could write mine. I stood up and picked up the knife. The blade was still sharp. My hand was still strong enough to hold it. Miles turned to leave the room, but before stepping out, he looked back. Tonight. 7 o'clock. Stay in the kitchen. I've got something I want you to try. I nodded. Surrounded by the smell of damp scallions, fermented flour, and wind howling through the old brick slats outside the tiny window, I placed the letter back on the shelf and returned to the prep counter as if nothing had happened. But every cut I made after that felt different. Slower. More deliberate. Like I was slicing through every thread that had bound me to the Evans name on that paper. And in my mind, a question began to form. If they wanted to write me out of my own story, did I have the courage to write it back, using blood, sweat, and my truest flavors? I headed to the basement of the pizza shop on a moonless night. Wind outside howling through the old brick seems like a quiet warning. The fluorescent light flickered, then steadied, casting a cold white glow across the low ceiling and unfinished brick walls. It used to be a flour and equipment storage space, rarely visited. But to me it felt like a shelter, silent, hidden, and private enough to breathe. I stood in the middle of it, not yet sure if I felt fear or resolve. I laid out my new plan on the old stainless steel table. This time the concept wasn't about trendy street food or easy buzz. I named it the memory of the forgotten child. No one else could cook it, because each dish was a slice of memory, and no one else was cruel enough to steal someone's pain and plate it. The first dish was a caramelized onion cream soup, made with leftover chicken broth I once reheated in a hospital room, blended with almond milk, because back then I couldn't afford cream. The second, a slice of dark rye sandwiching hand-cured smoked pork, served with roasted tomato sauce, my own tribute to the first breakfast I ate alone after leaving home. Every dish had its own name, like rainy morning at the corner, recess in the old kitchen, or the blanket that hid my tears. Each name was a fragment of soul. Every flavor a word unspoken. Miles was the first to taste. He sat at the edge of the kitchen where the light hit one freckled cheek. His eyes squinted slightly after the first spoonful. "This isn't fine dining," he said, "but it's the kind of food that makes people go quiet. And these days that's rarer than gold." I nodded. I don't want my customers to be impressed. I want them to remember. After a few nights, Miles started bringing in what he called old friends from closed kitchens. They were chefs with no current titles, once prominent in big-name restaurants, now vanished after burnout, scandal, or simply being forgotten. One had once run the line at a 5-star hotel. Now he was slicing mushrooms for me in a basement. Another had trained in Italy. Now he was prepping herbs over an ice bin. We worked in silence. No loud promotions, no marketing. Everyone in that small crew understood. This wasn't a culinary project. It was a test of whether a soul that had been erased could find its voice again. I designed the menu myself, hand-wrote every description, retelling the life behind each dish. I didn't print menus. I wrote each one in fountain pen on aged parchment paper, placed them on wooden tables next to small glasses of naturally fermented berry wine. Every corner had my imprint, nothing borrowed. One night as I was stoking the fire for the grill station, reserved for guests who requested the nostalgic style, my phone buzzed. An email. From Greg Walters, subject, "About your project," and a proposal. I tapped it open. "Charlotte, I know what they did. I was in the room when your mother and Brandon signed the agreement, and I had doubts from the start. But you should know they're not just seeking recognition. They want to erase you entirely from the story. If you're open to it, I'd like to meet, not as an investor but as someone who still believes in honesty. Maybe we can work together. But first, I want to hear your version." I read it again. Greg was one of the region's most respected investors, an old college friend of my father's. I'd met him once or twice at holiday parties, back when I was a 13-year-old girl clinging to a dessert tray. I didn't know what he wanted. A deal, a fresh opportunity, or maybe just a guilty conscience. I replied with a simple yes. It would come. But I would tell it honestly, from the very beginning. That night, I sat with Miles on the back steps leading to the fire escape behind the pizza shop. The scent of yeast hung in the crisp early spring air. I told him about the email. "Do you trust him?" he asked, eyes fixed on the small glass of wine in his hand. "I'm not sure," I answered honestly. But if someone sat in that meeting room while my name was being erased from a dish I created, and still had the guts to reach out, then maybe he's not all bad. Miles didn't reply. He just poured more wine into my glass and said slowly, "If you choose to tell your story, say it with fire. Even if someone tries to snuff it out." I raised my glass. "I've got nothing left to lose." He nodded. "That's usually the best time to begin." I arrived at Greg's showcase at 5:30 in the evening, exactly 30 minutes before the dinner began. The restaurant was tucked in an old riverside neighborhood, converted from a red brick warehouse with high ceilings and low-hanging industrial lights that cast a warm golden glow on each elegantly minimalist table. Greg had told me to come in through the back to avoid attention. I wasn't wearing a chef's uniform and I had no name tag. Just an old chef's knife wrapped in a gray cloth and a handwritten menu, the same kind we used in the basement. "Let them eat first," Greg whispered when I stepped into the makeshift kitchen in the side wing. "You'll walk out when I give the signal." I nodded and stayed hidden behind the partition, my heart pounding. Through the crack in the door, I saw my mother already seated at the center table, the spotlight of the room. Beside her sat Brandon in a light gray suit, his face full of confidence like he had the whole room in his pocket. I recognized several familiar faces from the food investment world, some who had rejected my proposals with no explanation, others who had once called my dishes over-personalized emotion. They sat there laughing, raising glasses, talking about nostalgic trends in street food, as if they had started them. When the first course came out, grilled sourdough topped with pickled radish sauce and smoked salmon, plated on ash-gray stoneware, the room quieted. I heard spoons gently tap bowls, a few soft gasps, then the first murmurs. "This smell. It's like something I remember but nothing I've ever had at any restaurant," a woman in a violet silk shawl said. "The second course will make them sit up straighter," Greg murmured, eyes on the room. I glanced toward the side kitchen where my team was working quietly and steadily. Miles wasn't there. He told me, "This is your stage. I don't want anyone thinking you needed a lead-in." The main dish went out 10 minutes later. Roasted chicken glazed with wine and herb honey, set on fermented mashed potatoes and topped with finely chopped marjoram. It was a refined version of the fried chicken my mother made on the rare days she cooked for the family, the only recipe I ever learned from her, but transformed into my own through trial, error, and countless quiet nights of note-taking. The entire room fell silent. No one spoke for the first 2 minutes. Then came the soft clink of a glass touching the table. A silver-bearded man said, "This can't be replicated. There's depth. It tells a story." That's when Greg stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, calm but firm, "the dishes you've enjoyed tonight are part of a very special project, with no brand name, no sponsor, no marketing. We call it storytelling cuisine, and the person who created it is right here." All eyes turned to me as Greg gave the signal. I stepped out of the kitchen, still holding the wrapped knife, not as a display but as a part of me, the one who had lived, tasted, and sweated with it. Some recognized me. Some looked shocked. Brandon shot up from his seat. "What is this?" Greg raised a hand, still calm. "You should sit down. We're not finished." My mother stood too. "You can't just announce that. Those recipes." Brandon presented them. "He signed the contracts. Do you have the paperwork?" Greg asked, eyes locked on hers. She pressed her lips tight. "Then if you'll allow me," Greg said, pulling a remote from his pocket and turning on the projector mounted on a pillar. The screen dropped down. Light flickered, revealing footage I had filmed 3 months ago in the basement, the first night I made the honey chicken. The timestamp was clear. There I was, writing notes by hand, and there was Miles tasting the first batch. One of the investors whispered, 3 months ago, but Brandon's pitch was only 6 weeks back. Brandon flushed red. "She faked that video." Greg didn't respond. He just pressed play again. A second video appeared, me discussing the menu with a Spanish-born chef, now one of my prep cooks. The audio was crystal clear. Every detail matched the dishes they had just eaten. "I think it's time we ask the real question," Greg said, looking around. "Who truly knows these dishes? Who spent 3 months in a small kitchen, perfecting every misstep to deliver the flavors you just experienced?" Silence blanketed the room. My mother grasped Brandon's hand. Neither spoke. I looked at them, not angry. I didn't need to say a word. I wasn't there to earn their validation. I was there to take back my name from everything they had denied. And I saw someone in the room looking at me not with pity or suspicion, but with respect. as if they finally saw a real chef. Not because of who I came from, but because of who I had become. Brandon pushed back his chair and stood, pointing at Greg. His voice came out too loud, shaking not with rage but confusion. You set me up. This was staged. Charlotte never had a plan until she found out I was pitching. She just shot some videos and made this up. No one responded. I didn't look at him. I looked straight at my mother, still seated back straight as if clinging to her flawless image. Her eyes flicked toward my father, then back to me as cold as ice. Do you even know what you're doing, Charlotte? She asked. You're humiliating the whole family in front of important people. Do you think anyone will want to do business with you after this? I opened my bag and pulled out a stack of double-sided printed documents. I handed copies to the investors at the table, keeping one for myself. This is a printout of an email my mother sent to her lawyer 2 months ago. The final sentence reads verbatim, "Please complete the process as soon as possible before the girl realizes these recipes have real commercial value. By nature, this is a family asset. It wasn't created by her alone but is the result of shared legacy." Whispers rippled through the room. A woman among the investors took out her reading glasses to study the page. Brandon froze, turning to his mother. She kept her expression still, but her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice finally faltering. "From your backup email account, the one you forgot to log out of when you borrowed my laptop 2 months ago," I said, eyes fixed on hers. "I stayed quiet, hoping you'd come clean. But you didn't." A heavy silence dropped over the room like a thick blanket. Then my father stood up. He'd been silent all evening, watching. The man who rarely said more than 3 sentences at any family gathering now stared at my mother, his voice dry but firm. "I've been quiet long enough." My mother turned, frowning. "What are you trying to say?" "I've watched you pin everything on Brandon since before he could do his own laundry. Fine, he's our son. But what about Charlotte? How many times was she alone after school while you were too busy? How many times did she win awards and you told her not to brag about kitchen hobbies? How many meals did she cook for us while you compared her to some TV chef?" "You don't understand," my mother snapped. "If I didn't push her, she'd still be hiding in that tiny kitchen. I just wanted her to think bigger." "No," my father said, his eyes fixed on her. "You wanted her silent. You couldn't stand the thought of her succeeding on her own terms." I never expected him to say that. My whole life he was the neutral one, the man who avoided conflict. But today I saw something in his eyes that wasn't exhaustion. It was regret. Brandon looked around, his face pale. "So what now? Cancel the project? Throw away months of work over one emotional performance?" Greg sat back down, arms folded. "We don't choose people based on last names or family ties. We choose based on taste, technique, and truth. Charlotte proved all of those. As for your project, Brandon, if you wish to continue, you may, but not with recipes that were improperly filed." Another investor chimed in. "And if that intellectual property filing was based on false data, it won't just be voided, it'll be considered fraudulent." Brandon swallowed hard. I saw something unfamiliar in his eyes, genuine confusion. My mother turned toward me, tilting slightly as if trying to reclaim the last of her authority. "Charlotte, you should think this through. Don't let this become a stain. Family is forever. You may be praised today, but what about tomorrow? When you fail, who will be there?" I looked at her, no anger, no shouting, and answered softly, "I don't fail by walking alone. I only fail when I let someone else hold the pen to my story." The answer wasn't loud, but I saw her hesitate. Something flickered in her eyes, not because I was right, but because I no longer needed her approval. I turned to Greg and gave him a quiet nod. "Thank you for letting me speak." He nodded back. "This isn't the end, Charlotte. This is the beginning." I saw my father nod too, his first since I left home. He didn't need to say a word. By simply rising from his chair, he acknowledged my existence, not as someone's shadow, not as the family's disappointment, but as a human being with a name, a voice, and the right to own her own path. I sat across from Greg at a small cafe near the harbor, the oak table worn smooth by time, the smell of roasted beans slipping in through the open window. He pulled a thick file from his briefcase and set it on the table. "This is a preliminary investment plan," he said. "If you're in, we'll start with 2 food trucks. One in the city, one in the suburbs near weekend festivals. If things go well, we'll scale within 6 months. It'll be entirely under your brand, and all creative rights to the menu remain yours. I looked at the first page. My name was printed clearly at the top. Charlotte Evans, Culinary Creative Lead. A strange feeling rose in my throat like swallowing a stone of ice. I once thought I'd have to trade away a lifetime just to see that name printed above the work I built. There's one condition, I said, calmer than I expected. Greg looked up. Go on. I don't need them to kneel. I don't need my parents to cry in public. But I do want a public apology at the launch. A clear statement. No spin, no deflection. In front of the press, in front of the guest. Not for the spotlight. For my dignity. Greg was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Understood. I'll handle the press. As for them, that's up to them. 3 days later, I met my mother and Brandon at the old house. The space was so familiar I could still walk into the kitchen blindfolded without stumbling. But it felt cold enough to make me pull my hands from my coat pockets just to calm the ache in my chest. I laid out my terms clearly, like I used to lay a knife flat against a cutting board. Brandon reacted first. He laughed, a dry, joyless sound. What do you want? Me up on stage confessing my sins? You standing there like some winner while I look like a fool? I didn't answer. I just looked at him, deeply. No anger. No pity. He exhaled. I'm not doing it. That project, that work. No matter how well you cook, I'm not the villain. Then don't show up, I said evenly. But your name will never appear anywhere on my brand. He turned and walked out. No more words. I didn't watch him go. I'd lost him long ago. This was just the first time I'd said it out loud. My mother remained seated. She said nothing the entire time. Her fingers wrapped around a glass of lukewarm tea, her eyes trying to search through old memories but finding nothing to hold on to. I'm not trying to humiliate you, I said. But you spent a lifetime telling me to keep quiet, to not make it a big deal, to protect our image. Well, today I choose to speak. An apology, that's all I need to believe I'm not just borrowing this life. She stayed silent for a long while. Then suddenly my father, who had stood against the wall, quiet all along, stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder. Will you let me wear the apron? He asked, his gaze soft like those afternoons when he taught me to toast bread over charcoal in the backyard. I nodded. He turned to my mother, unbuttoned his coat and pulled out an old apron from his pocket, the one she used to wear when she made Friday night dinners, long untouched. She looked at him for a moment, said nothing, then slowly stood and took it. I didn't need words. That simple gesture was enough for my heart to know she had finally heard me. On opening day, the sun was kind. In front of the venue where the 2 cream-colored food trucks stood ready, balloon garlands stretched neatly, and the guest tables sat beneath golden maple trees just beginning to turn. The press was present, cameras flashing non-stop. I wore a white chef's coat, a wine-red wristband, the color I chose for the brand, the same shade as the handkerchief she used to pin in her hair when she cooked. Greg stood beside me, smiling. But I only focused on 2 people approaching from across the lawn. My father and mother. She wore a soft gray dress, a chestnut coat, and held a folded piece of paper. As they neared, she stopped, took a long breath, and spoke before I could even begin the introductions. I'm Eleanor Evans, Charlotte's mother, she said. Her voice didn't shake, but there was a faint split in her tone, like a thread just barely frayed. I used to believe I was protecting my daughter by teaching her to obey, to value reputation and not to dream too far. I was wrong. I made her fight to be seen. I made her leave to find space. Today I'm sorry. No one said a word. But in that moment, I heard the wind rustle through the rows of hanging flags. I felt my heart lift, not with resentment, not with bitterness, but with lightness. I stepped forward and took my mother's hand. She hesitated, then gently squeezed. Thank you all for being here, I said, turning toward the cameras. Welcome to the first opening of The Forgotten Spoon, where every dish is a memory, and everyone who's ever been left behind deserves a place back at the table. My parents stood on either side of me, each holding a handle of the scissors as we cut the red ribbon together. When the ribbon split in 2, she reached up to wipe her eyes, not hiding it at all. I didn't see her as a teacher, a controller, or someone trying to shape me, but just as a mother standing next to her daughter under the early morning sun, with the scent of food rising from a kitchen I had built with my own 2 hands. 6 months after that ribbon-cutting day, I don't think a single morning passed without a notification lighting up my phone. Someone tagging a photo of my food truck with the caption, "This isn't just food. This is a story." Some days I stood outside the truck just to watch the long, winding line of people around the weekend market. Some came out of curiosity, some had seen the video of the launch. Others came just to try the herb honey chicken by the girl once forgotten. They ate and then stayed. Some to listen, some just to nod at the small handwritten sign taped behind the counter. Everyone deserves a meal made just for them. The press started calling me the woman who tells stories through food. I never corrected them. But deep down, I didn't feel like a storyteller. I was just continuing the parts of a childhood dinner that had been cut short. The parts never served because they were seen as unimportant. One night after a long shift, I received an email from my mother. She didn't call, didn't text. She chose to write as if she wanted each word to have time to sink in. "Charlotte, back then I only knew how to teach school. I taught students how to use full sentences and put punctuation in the right places. But I never realized you were teaching me how to listen to a story with no period. Every dish you make is a paragraph no one ever noticed, and I've been reading it wrong for so many years. I'm learning now. Your daughter, I hope you still have a seat at the table for someone who once read the wrong book." I read that email over and over under the dim kitchen light. I didn't need to reply right away because some things need to rise in silence, like dough that can't be rushed. I started volunteering once a week at a local community center that offered free cooking classes for kids who had experienced abuse, abandonment, or were from fractured families. Their eyes were wary the first time, but slowly a light began to show. Part curiosity, part caution, and something else they hadn't yet named: hunger. Not hunger for food, but for the feeling that someone had placed a meal in front of them simply to make them feel warm. One Saturday afternoon, just after we'd finished a batch of sourdough, a little girl with curly hair tied in 2 ponytails asked me, "Do you remember the first dish you ever made by yourself?" I froze. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because the question caught me off guard in its simplicity. I sat down beside her, flour still on my apron. "When I was about 8, I began. There was a day my mom forgot to pick me up after school. The building closed and I sat by myself in a hallway near the cafeteria. The smell of toasted bread filled the air. And I don't know if it was from hunger or sadness, but I snuck in and stole one last slice of bread still left in the oven. I didn't eat it right away. I hid it in my desk. The kids sat quietly watching me. When I got home, dinner was already cold. No one asked if I'd eaten. I went to my room, crawled under the table, and pulled out that slice. It was a little hard, a little dry, but at that moment it was the first thing I ever chose for myself. No one forced it. No one forgot it. Another child asked, "Were you sad?" I nodded. Yes. But later, when I thought about it, I was thankful for that slice of bread. It didn't just feed me. It taught me that if no one puts food on the table for you, you can still make it yourself, even with trembling hands. I pointed to the oven behind us. "And now you're doing that too. Every loaf you bake today is your way of saying, 'I belong here.'" Their eyes met mine, no longer guarded. One child smiled. Another leaned forward to peek at the oven, where a round loaf was rising slowly, releasing a soft, sweet scent. There was no applause, no words of praise. Just that look, and I knew I had given more than a meal. That night, back in the main food truck kitchen, I opened the old fridge that Miles had once told me to keep, like a useful memory. Inside the bottom shelf was a bowl of rising dough. I gently lifted the lid. The mellow scent of yeast rose to my nose, warm and alive. I pressed a fingertip to the center of the dough. Just moist enough. It had risen full and smooth, no longer sharp with sourness like it had been in the beginning. I smiled softly. Some things can't be rushed. Some cracks have to breathe before they heal. And some forms of love, if given time, will ferment into something no one else can imitate. I gently placed a white cloth over the bowl, returned it to the fridge, then turned toward the stove where the light still glowed warm. And inside I knew, my meal wasn't finished yet. It was still unfolding, dish by dish, person by person, and rise by rise. If you've listened this far, maybe you've had meals with empty seats across from you. Or dreams pushed aside to make room for someone else's. I don't know if you've ever cooked something just to remind yourself you still exist. But if you have, I hope my story gives you a little warmth, a little courage, and a seat at your own table. What do you think about how family can hurt us, but also be where healing begins? I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. Who knows? Someone might find themselves in your story too. If you want to keep walking with me through honest slices of life about family, scars, food, and quiet hope, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes just one small moment in family life can change an entire life.